My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 40 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of woman people rely on without really thinking about it. I've been a wife, a professional, a steady presence behind the scenes, the one who remembers details, keeps things moving, and rarely asks for attention in return. People usually describe me as calm, reasonable, easy to be married to. What they often mean is that I don't demand much space. I don't raise my voice. I don't dramatize my feelings. Over time, that calmness became something others misread. They assumed that because I didn't complain, I didn't feel the weight of things. Because I didn't resist, I didn't notice. This is not a story about a sudden betrayal or a loud ending. There was no explosive argument, no single sentence that shattered everything. My marriage ended quietly, so quietly that for a long time, even I struggled to pinpoint when it began to slip away. My husband left me after years of marriage, and later, he came back. What you're about to hear isn't a revenge story. I'm not here to expose anyone or to prove who was right or wrong. I'm sharing this because what happened to me is more common than people admit, and far less dramatic than the stories we usually tell. This is a story about being underestimated in a long relationship, about how usefulness can be mistaken for loyalty and silence mistaken for acceptance. It's about the slow erosion that happens when someone assumes you'll always be there, exactly as you are, exactly where they left you. When my husband left, there was no collapse, no public unraveling. Life simply became quieter in a different way. And in that quiet, something unexpected happened. I began to see myself clearly, without having to adjust my shape to fit someone else's expectation. You'll hear about the role I played for years without realizing it had been assigned to me. About the small moments everyone else overlooked, but I never forgot. About the internal shift that didn't announce itself, didn't ask permission, and didn't need an audience. When he returned, he thought he was coming back to familiarity, to stability, to the woman who had always made things easy. What he didn't understand was that the version of me he left behind no longer existed. There are no villains in this story, just two people who grew in different directions at different speeds. One of us noticed, the other didn't, until much later. I'm telling this honestly, without embellishment, because sometimes the most powerful changes don't look powerful at all from the outside. Sometimes they look like silence, like patience, like nothing happening. And before we begin, I want to ask you something, quietly, honestly. Have you ever realized that the moment someone starts missing you is often the moment you finally stop making yourself convenient for them? For a long time, I was known as the reliable one, not just to my husband, but to almost everyone around us. Friends would ask me to organize dinners. Family assumed I'd remember birthdays, appointments, quiet obligations that kept things running smoothly. At work, I was the person people trusted to fix what was broken without making it visible that anything had gone wrong. To them, I was steady, predictable in the best way, someone who didn't complicate things. In my marriage, that steadiness became my defining trait. I was the woman who adjusted without being asked. If plans changed, I adapted. If moods shifted, I absorbed the impact quietly. I learned early on that harmony was valued more than honesty. So I practiced keeping the peace until it became instinct. My husband would often say, "You're so easy to be with." He meant it as a compliment. I accepted it as one. What I didn't realize then was how easiness slowly turned into invisibility. I wasn't ignored outright. That would have been easier to name. Instead, I was assumed. My presence became part of the background, like good lighting or a stable internet connection. Necessary, but not consciously appreciated unless it disappeared. When we were with others, I was the quiet support, the listener, the one who filled in gaps without drawing attention to myself. People didn't ask what I wanted because I rarely expressed it. And I rarely expressed it because I didn't want to be a burden. There was no cruelty in this, no intentional dismissal, just a gradual narrowing of how I was seen. Over time, I noticed that conversations rarely centered on me unless I steered them there, and I almost never did. Decisions were made around me, not against me. It was subtle enough that I questioned my own perception. After all, nothing was wrong. I was respected, trusted, included, just not prioritized. I remember standing in kitchens during gatherings, refilling drinks while conversations happened around me. Sitting beside my husband as he talked about his ambitions, his frustrations, his plans. I listened carefully, offered thoughtful responses, remembered details. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. I didn't want to interrupt the rhythm. I told myself this was maturity, partnership, love expressed through restraint. But invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in quietly, disguised as being needed but not seen. At work, people praised my consistency. At home, that consistency became expected. I was the woman who held things together, which meant no one asked how much effort it took to do so. When you don't complain, people assume there's nothing to complain about. I don't say this with bitterness. At the time, I believed this role made me valuable. I thought being low maintenance was a form of strength. I thought my calmness gave others space, and that space would be returned when I needed it. It rarely was. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my role had become: dependable, adaptable, quietly supportive. I didn't resist it because it felt safer than asking for more. Asking for more risked being seen as difficult, and I had spent years proving I wasn't. I didn't feel unhappy. That's important to say. I felt contained, like a part of myself had been carefully folded away so everything else could function smoothly. I told myself this was adulthood, that wanting less attention was a sign of emotional intelligence. What I didn't realize was that by being so easy to live with, I had made it easy to overlook me. To them, I was the woman who would always be there, always steady, always understanding. Someone whose absence was unthinkable because it had never been imagined. And perhaps that was the most dangerous part of all. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, no clear offense anyone else could point to. That's why it lingered. Because it would have been easier to dismiss if it had been obvious. It happened on an ordinary evening. We were having dinner with friends, people we'd known for years. The conversation drifted easily, as it always did, moving from work to travel to small frustrations that felt safe to share in company. At one point, someone asked about a decision we had recently made together. I answered without thinking, calmly, the way I always did. My husband interrupted me mid sentence, not sharply, not unkindly. He simply continued the story as if I hadn't spoken at all, correcting a minor detail that didn't actually need correcting. The group followed his lead without hesitation. The conversation moved on. No one noticed, not even him. I stopped speaking and smiled, the way people do when they don't want to disrupt the moment. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, something registered, quietly, precisely. It wasn't the interruption itself. People interrupt each other all the time. It was the ease of it. The way my voice disappeared without resistance. The way no one looked back to see if I had finished my thought. I remember thinking, that was strange. Not painful, just clear. Later that night, while we were cleaning up, I mentioned it lightly, not accusingly. I said something like, I don't think I finished what I was saying earlier. He looked genuinely confused, then slightly amused. Oh, he said, I didn't even notice. He wasn't defensive. That's what made it harder to hold on to my discomfort. There was no apology, but there was no malice either. Just an unspoken assumption that if something mattered, I would have insisted on finishing. I told myself I was being sensitive, that this was normal, that long marriages came with small overlaps, moments of misalignment. I let it go. But I didn't forget it. That night became a reference point, not because it hurt deeply, but because it revealed something quietly important. It showed me how easily my presence could be overwritten, not out of disrespect, but out of habit. After that, I began to notice similar moments, small ones. My suggestions acknowledged and then reshaped into someone else's idea. My preferences met with a quick, whatever works, that ended the discussion. My opinions heard, but not held. Each moment was small enough to ignore on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. I didn't confront it. I didn't want to turn a series of minor moments into a problem that seemed larger than it was. I didn't want to be the person who reads into things, so I adjusted. I spoke a little less. I chose my words more carefully. I waited for pauses that rarely came, and when they didn't, I stayed quiet. I became very good at convincing myself that none of this mattered, that I was mature enough to let small things go, that relationships weren't about being heard all the time. But there was something unsettling about how easily my silence blended into the background, how quickly it became expected. That first interruption wasn't a wound, it was a signal, one I didn't know how to interpret yet. I carried it with me, not as resentment, but as awareness. A small internal note that something had shifted, even if nothing on the surface looked different. At the time, I still believed that if I continued being patient, being understanding, being easy to live with, the balance would correct itself. I didn't yet understand that patterns don't break themselves. They deepen, especially when no one questions them. After that first moment, nothing changed on the surface. And yet, everything felt slightly different underneath. Once you notice something, you can't unknow it. The interruptions didn't become more aggressive, they became more normal. They showed up in ordinary places, conversations, decisions, casual exchanges that didn't feel important enough to challenge. If I started a sentence and someone else finished it for me, I let them. If my husband rephrased my thoughts in his own words, I told myself he was just clarifying. If plans were made without asking for my input, I reasoned that I was flexible anyway. Flexibility became my justification. I told myself that relationships required compromise, and I was simply better at it than most people. That my ability to let things slide was a sign of emotional maturity. That not everything needed to be discussed, examined, or named. And for a while, that explanation worked. But something subtle began to happen. I stopped checking in with myself before agreeing to things. I didn't ask whether I wanted something. I asked whether it was worth mentioning. Most of the time, I decided it wasn't. When you consistently choose peace over presence, you don't disappear all at once. You fade in increments. My husband didn't become cruel. He became efficient. He assumed my agreement before I gave it. He filled in my silence with his own conclusions. And because I rarely corrected him, those conclusions solidified into facts. At gatherings, he spoke for both of us. At home, decisions moved forward with a quiet momentum that didn't leave much room for pause. If I hesitated, it was interpreted as indecision, not reflection. I could have spoken up. That's the part people often point to later. And they're not wrong. But what they don't see is how many times I told myself, this isn't the hill to die on. So many hills, so many quiet retreats. I normalized it by comparing myself to others. I told myself every marriage had imbalances, that everyone made small sacrifices, that wanting more attention was immature, that I was lucky to have stability. And I was, in many ways. But stability without presence has a way of hollowing you out slowly. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It tells you that you're doing the right thing by staying quiet, that you're being generous, that one day someone will notice. That day didn't come. Instead, my silence became part of the structure of our life. It supported everything, which meant it was never questioned. The more I absorbed, the more was placed on me to absorb. Emotional labor, flexibility, understanding. I became the buffer between tension and peace, and buffers are designed to be invisible. What surprised me most was how easy it was to explain all of this away. To myself, to others. I had language for it. Words like adaptable, low conflict, supportive. They sounded positive, responsible. No one warned me that you can rationalize yourself into erasure. There were moments when a quiet discomfort surfaced, usually late at night, usually alone. I'd feel a vague sense of being slightly out of alignment with my own life. Not unhappy, just absent. I told myself this was normal adulthood, that passion cooled, that identity softened, that wanting to be seen was something you grew out of. I didn't realize that what I was growing out of was myself. By the time I noticed how deeply the pattern had set in, it felt permanent, unchangeable without disruption. And disruption felt selfish. So I stayed quiet. I stayed useful. I stayed easy. And in doing so, I taught everyone around me exactly how much of me they could overlook. At some point, without any formal discussion, my role became fixed, not announced, not negotiated, simply assumed. I was the one who would handle things, the one who would adjust, the one who would not need much. I didn't notice the moment it solidified, only the moment I stopped questioning it. In our marriage, I was no longer just a partner. I was a function, the emotional stabilizer, the planner, the one who anticipated needs before they were spoken. If something needed to be remembered, I remembered it. If something needed to be smoothed over, I smoothed it. This wasn't demanded of me. That's what made it so easy to accept. No one told me, this is who you are now. They simply relied on me to be it. Over time, expectations replaced curiosity. My husband didn't ask what I thought as often. He assumed. He didn't check in emotionally unless something was visibly wrong. And because I rarely showed distress, everything appeared fine. I became the woman people leaned on, not the woman they leaned toward. When you're reliable, people stop asking if you're tired. When you're calm, they stop wondering if you're hurting. When you're quiet, they stop checking whether you agree. I saw this role reflected back at me in small ways. The way people spoke around me instead of to me. The way decisions were presented as updates rather than conversations. The way my emotional steadiness was treated as an infinite resource. And still, I didn't resist. Part of me believed this role made me indispensable, that being needed was a form of love, that if I continued being the steady presence, the foundation, the anchor, I would always have a place. But anchors don't move, they hold. I remember a moment that clarified this for me. We were discussing a potential change, something that would affect both of us. My husband spoke confidently about how it would work, how I would adapt, how it wouldn't be a problem. He said, "You'll be fine with it," not as a question, as a statement. I nodded, not because I had considered it and agreed, but because correcting him felt like unnecessary friction. In that moment, I realized something unsettling. My adaptability had become a permission slip, permission to decide without me, permission to speak for me, permission to assume my consent. The role I had been assigned wasn't cruel, it was efficient. I was the quiet constant in a life that valued forward motion. And constants don't get consulted, they get used. I didn't feel angry. I felt categorized, like a piece of furniture that had always been there, reliable, functional, rarely examined. What frightened me wasn't that others saw me this way. It was that I had begun to see myself this way too. I measured my value by how smoothly things ran, by how little trouble I caused, by how rarely my needs interrupted the flow of someone else's life. I told myself this was maturity, that this was what long-term commitment looked like, that wanting more attention or recognition was a sign of insecurity. But deep down, something resisted that narrative. A quiet part of me that hadn't disappeared, only gone dormant. That part didn't want to be dramatic. It didn't want to argue. It just wanted to be considered. I didn't yet know what I would do with that realization. I only knew that once I saw the role clearly, I could no longer pretend it didn't exist. And roles, once recognized, eventually demand a choice. Continue performing them, or step away. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no dramatic realization, no moment that would have looked important from the outside. If you had seen me that day, you would have thought nothing was different at all. That's what made it so significant. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was alone in the apartment, the kind of quiet that usually felt neutral to me. I had just finished a long work call and was standing by the window, looking out at the grey sky that so often hung over the city. Everything was still, no urgency, no tension. And in that stillness, I felt a strange clarity. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness. It was a simple, steady awareness. I don't feel present in my own life. That thought didn't scare me. It didn't rush. It settled. For the first time in a long while, I didn't try to explain it away. I didn't tell myself it was normal or temporary or selfish to notice. I just let the thought exist. I realized I had been living reactively, responding to expectations, adjusting to needs, filling spaces that were already defined for me. I wasn't choosing much, I was maintaining. And maintenance, I understood in that moment, is not the same as participation. I thought about how rarely I asked myself what I wanted. Not in a dramatic sense, no fantasies of escape or reinvention, but in small, daily ways. What I preferred, what I needed, what I felt. Those questions had quietly left my vocabulary. Standing there, I didn't make any decisions. I didn't plan an exit. I didn't confront anyone. I simply acknowledged that something in me had reached its limit. Not loudly, but definitively. I felt done. Not with my marriage, not with my life, but with the version of myself that kept disappearing to keep things running smoothly. Later that evening, my husband came home. We talked about ordinary things: dinner, schedules, plans. I listened the way I always had. I responded appropriately. Nothing in my behavior changed. But inside, something had reoriented. I stopped waiting for him to notice me. That may sound small, but it was profound. I realized how much of my emotional energy had been invested in being seen without asking, in hoping my consistency would eventually be recognized as depth. In that moment of clarity, I withdrew that expectation, not bitterly, just cleanly. I didn't feel resentful. I felt calm, almost relieved. For the first time, I understood that silence didn't have to mean endurance. It could mean choice. That night, lying in bed, I didn't replay conversations or imagine explanations. I didn't rehearse what I would say if asked. I simply observed how still I felt. There was no urge to fix anything immediately, no pressure to act, just a quiet internal alignment. I didn't know yet what would change, only that I would no longer betray myself by pretending I didn't exist. That shift didn't make me louder. It made me more precise. From that day on, my silence stopped being automatic. It became intentional. And intention changes everything, even when no one else notices it yet. After that day, nothing on the outside changed. And yet, everything I did from that point on came from a different place. My silence was no longer reflexive. It was deliberate. I still listened. I still responded calmly. I still fulfilled my responsibilities at home and at work. But I stopped filling in emotional gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped anticipating needs before they were expressed. I stopped smoothing over moments of discomfort before anyone else had a chance to feel them. To anyone watching, I looked the same: reliable, unbothered, agreeable. But internally, I was no longer disappearing. I was observing. I noticed how quickly my husband continued conversations without checking whether I was engaged. How often he spoke in conclusions instead of questions. How rarely anyone noticed when I withheld my usual emotional labor. At first, no one reacted. That told me everything I needed to know. My silence had been doing so much work that its absence wasn't immediately visible. Like removing a support beam that no one realized was load bearing. I didn't correct assumptions right away. Not to test anyone, but to understand the system I was part of. When I stopped volunteering explanations, people supplied their own. They assumed I agreed, that I didn't mind, that I was still the same. And because I didn't interrupt those assumptions, they continued. This was the moment many people misunderstand. Silence, when chosen, isn't passive. It's diagnostic. It shows you exactly how people interpret you when you stop managing their comfort. Some mistook my quiet for withdrawal. Others mistook it for loyalty. A few assumed I was tired. No one assumed I was changing. That invisibility, for the first time, worked in my favor. I began to reclaim energy I hadn't realized I was spending. Emotional energy, cognitive energy, the constant low-level effort of making myself easy to be around. I didn't use that energy to confront or demand. I used it to pay attention. I watched patterns, not to judge them, but to see them clearly. Who asked follow-up questions? Who filled silence with curiosity? Who simply moved on? My husband didn't notice at first. Why would he? The structure of our life still functioned. Meals happened, plans happened, conversations happened, just without my invisible scaffolding. He interpreted my quieter presence as stability, as acceptance, as reassurance. I let him, not out of spite, out of clarity. Because for the first time, I wasn't interested in managing how I was perceived. I was interested in understanding reality as it was, not as I hoped it might become. There's a strange power in not correcting people when they misunderstand you, when you're no longer invested in being understood at all costs. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply no longer volunteering parts of myself that were never reciprocated. At work, the same shift occurred. I stopped preemptively fixing things that weren't assigned to me. I did my job well, but no longer invisibly. The difference was subtle, but the effects were immediate. Gaps appeared, questions surfaced, assumptions were challenged. At home, the gaps took longer to register. Emotional systems change more slowly than professional ones. But eventually, something began to wobble. My husband grew slightly more restless. Not alarmed, just unsettled. He couldn't name why. The familiar ease was still there, but something underneath it felt different. He didn't ask. He assumed. And that assumption, once again, spoke volumes. Silence, when chosen, creates space. And space reveals truth. Not loudly, but unmistakably. While nothing seemed to change on the surface, a great deal was happening underneath. Quietly, methodically, in ways no one thought to look for. Because no one imagined I was preparing for anything at all. That was the advantage of being underestimated. I didn't announce a new phase of my life. I didn't journal dramatically or mark dates on a calendar. I simply began paying closer attention to how things actually worked. Financially, emotionally, structurally. I wanted to understand the systems I was part of, not from hope or habit, but from fact. I started with information. I reviewed our shared finances more carefully than I ever had before. Not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I had never fully seen them. I learned where money moved automatically, where decisions were assumed rather than discussed, and how much responsibility quietly rested on my shoulders without recognition. I didn't confront, I documented. I noted patterns, expenses that were considered essential when they served one person's priorities, savings goals that existed in theory but not in practice, financial conversations that ended quickly once they became inconvenient. This wasn't about catching anyone out, it was about clarity. I wanted to know exactly what my position was, because I had realized how long I had operated without that knowledge. At the same time, I began to observe emotional dynamics with the same precision. I paid attention to who initiated repair after tension, who followed up after distance, who assumed things would resolve themselves without effort. For years, that had been me. Now, I stopped stepping in automatically. And what I noticed surprised me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. When I didn't follow up, things stayed unresolved. When I didn't prompt emotional connection, it didn't happen organically. When I didn't carry the weight of continuity, continuity weakened. None of this was malicious, but it was revealing. I also began to invest quietly in myself, not in obvious ways. No declarations, no transformations anyone could comment on. I refined skills that had always been secondary to everyone else's needs. I strengthened my professional footing. I ensured that my independence wasn't theoretical, it was real. This wasn't rebellion, it was grounding. I made sure that if anything changed, I wouldn't be scrambling to find stability. I wanted my footing to be firm long before it was tested. What they never noticed was that I had stopped relying on reassurance. I no longer needed verbal confirmation of my value. I was building something internal and structural, something that didn't require permission. My husband still saw me as steady, dependable, unshakable. He didn't see the shift because it didn't look like resistance. It looked like the same calm he had always known, the same silence, the same composure. But the meaning had changed. I was no longer maintaining the relationship at my own expense. I was maintaining myself. There is a particular kind of preparation that happens when you're not angry, when you're clear. It's not rushed, it's not emotional, it's careful. I wasn't planning an ending, I was preparing for any outcome. And when you're prepared for all outcomes, fear loses its leverage. I didn't feel empowered in a dramatic way. I felt settled, like I finally understood the ground beneath my feet. What they never noticed was that I had stopped waiting, stopped hoping, stopped needing circumstances to change in order for me to feel whole. I had quietly positioned myself in my own life. And once that happens, everything else becomes a choice, not a necessity. The reveal didn't arrive like a revelation. There was no shock, no rush of adrenaline, no sense of triumph. It came slowly, almost quietly, as I sat with the information I had gathered and allowed myself to see it without distortion. What I discovered wasn't a secret someone had hidden from me. It was a truth I had never fully examined. I realized how much of the relationship's stability depended on me, not emotionally, but structurally, financially, logistically, in ways that had become invisible because they had never been questioned. I was the one who tracked long-term planning, the one who ensured deadlines were met, the one who absorbed uncertainty so others wouldn't have to. And because I did it without complaint, it had never been recognized as leverage. But leverage doesn't need to be announced to exist. The private reveal wasn't about power over someone else. It was about understanding my own position clearly for the first time. I saw how many systems relied on my quiet participation, how many assumptions rested on my continued presence. And more importantly, I saw that none of it was guaranteed. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sober. There's something sobering about realizing that your value has been structural rather than emotional, that you've been essential but not necessarily cherished, useful but not fully seen. That realization could have made me bitter. It didn't. It made me honest. I also saw something else, something equally important. I saw how little had been built to sustain me, how my own needs had been deferred, minimized, absorbed into the larger functioning of the relationship. The leverage wasn't just external, it was internal. I realized I no longer needed permission to choose myself. I didn't need agreement or validation. The work I had done quietly meant that I could step back without chaos. At least not chaos I would be responsible for managing. That clarity changed how I held myself, how I listened, how I responded. I stopped over explaining. I stopped justifying pauses. I stopped filling silence with reassurance. Not to provoke, but because I didn't need to. The reveal also forced me to confront something uncomfortable. My husband didn't know me as well as he thought he did. Not because he hadn't paid attention, but because I had curated myself carefully to remain easy. He thought he knew my limits. He didn't know where they were because I had never marked them. I didn't share this realization. It wasn't something to discuss. It wasn't a threat or a bargaining chip. It was private. And private truths are often the most powerful. From that moment on, I understood that whatever came next, whether we stayed together or not, I would not return to the version of myself that made my presence effortless at my own expense. The reveal wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was simply the moment I stopped underestimating myself. Once you see clearly, indecision becomes harder to justify. Not because the choice is easy, but because pretending you don't have one is no longer possible. That was where I found myself. I understood my position. I understood the systems. I understood my own capacity. What remained was the decision. Not whether something would change, but how it would. There were options, more than I had allowed myself to see before. I could speak up, ask for recalibration, request space, attention, adjustment. I could explain how I felt, carefully, rationally, the way I always did. I knew how that conversation would go. He would listen. He would be surprised. He might even promise to do better. And for a while, he probably would. But I also knew something else. I knew how deeply the existing dynamic was ingrained, how quickly patterns reassert themselves when the underlying structure remains unchanged. I had lived that cycle long enough to recognize it. Another option was to wait, to continue observing, to see if my withdrawal would prompt reflection or curiosity, to allow him the opportunity to notice without being told. I waited. He didn't. That told me what I needed to know. The final option, the one I had avoided even naming, was to step away. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but definitively. That option didn't come with a rush of emotion. It came with a sense of gravity. Because once chosen, it couldn't be undone. I didn't make the decision in a moment of pain. I made it in a moment of calm. That's important I realized that staying would require me to keep performing a role I no longer believed in. Leaving would require me to trust the foundation I had quietly built. One choice preserved familiarity, the other preserved integrity. I chose integrity. I didn't announce the decision right away. I didn't need to. Decisions don't become real because they're spoken. They become real because behavior aligns with them. I began taking steps that reflected my choice. Subtle ones, preparatory ones, not to hurt anyone, but to honor the clarity I had reached. The irreversible part wasn't leaving, it was refusing to return to self erasure. Even if we stayed together, that version of me was gone. And I knew, with a calm certainty, that the relationship as it existed couldn't survive that change. That knowledge didn't frighten me, it steadied me. Because for the first time, I wasn't choosing based on fear of loss. I was choosing based on respect for myself. That's the kind of choice that changes everything, even before anyone else realizes it's been made. Once the decision was made, my life didn't change outwardly. That was intentional. I didn't want a reaction. I wanted alignment. I moved quietly, not because I was hiding, but because nothing I was doing required permission or explanation. I began with structure. I separated what had always been blurred: accounts, responsibilities, information. Not aggressively, just clearly. I made sure I understood my legal standing, my financial autonomy, my professional stability. I didn't rush. I didn't dramatize. I verified. At the same time, I reduced my emotional footprint in the marriage. Not coldly, just accurately. I stopped cushioning disappointment. I stopped translating silence into reassurance. I stopped making myself the interpreter between comfort and truth. To my husband, nothing seemed wrong. If anything, I appeared calmer, more centered, less reactive. He took that as a sign that everything was stable. That assumption gave me space. I didn't provoke conversations. I didn't seek closure. I allowed life to unfold as it was and observed how little initiative came from his side when I wasn't guiding it. The silence wasn't hostile, it was neutral. And neutrality is often more unsettling than conflict, though he hadn't noticed it yet. I also stopped explaining my time, where I was going, what I was thinking, not out of secrecy, but out of ownership. My inner world was no longer a shared resource by default. At work, the changes became visible faster. Without my invisible interventions, processes slowed, questions surfaced. My contributions, once assumed, became measurable. No one confronted me. They adjusted. That contrast stayed with me. At home, the adjustment lagged. Comfort had inertia. It takes longer to notice when something foundational shifts, especially if it has always worked without effort. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt precise. Every step I took reduced my dependence on outcomes I didn't control. I wasn't planning an escape. I was creating stability regardless of what happened next. There is a certain quiet confidence that comes from knowing you don't need to argue to be free. You don't need to be understood to be done. I didn't change my tone. I didn't change my demeanor. I changed my investment. And when investment changes, dynamics follow, even if no one can yet name why. Eventually, my husband sensed something. Not clearly, not consciously, just a vague discomfort. He didn't ask the right questions. He asked none at all. I let that stand. Because by then, I understood something fundamental. People notice loss only after it affects them. They notice change only when it interrupts their expectations. I was still there, but I was no longer holding everything together. And that difference was already beginning to matter. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They came in small disruptions, minor enough to be dismissed, but frequent enough to create unease. At first, it showed up as confusion. My husband misplaced things more often, forgot dates he had never had to remember before. He seemed mildly irritated by inconveniences he couldn't quite explain. Small delays, missed cues, conversations that felt unfinished. He didn't connect these moments to me. Why would he? I was still there, still calm, still doing my part, just not all of it. What had changed was invisible. The background work, the emotional anticipation, the silent corrections, the reminders that never needed to be spoken because I handled them before they became problems. Without that, life didn't fall apart. It just became less smooth. He started asking questions framed as observations. Did we always do it this way? Something feels off lately. I responded honestly, but briefly. I didn't rush to resolve his discomfort. I didn't rush at all. The more I stepped back, the more he stepped forward, but awkwardly, as if trying to operate a system he'd never had to understand. At work, the contrast sharpened. My absence from certain processes became noticeable, not dramatic, but undeniable. People began looping me in again, this time intentionally. My value was no longer assumed, it was requested. That difference stayed with me. At home, the imbalance grew slowly. Conversations lost their rhythm. Decisions stalled. Emotional ease gave way to mild tension. Not enough to spark a confrontation, but enough to register. My husband grew quieter, more distracted. He didn't know what he was missing, only that something wasn't being carried for him anymore. There was a moment that crystallized this shift. He asked me, casually, if I was upset about something. I looked at him and said calmly, no, because I wasn't. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger ever would have. He waited for elaboration. I didn't offer any. The truth was simple. I wasn't upset. I was detached. Not cold, just no longer over-invested. He began to feel the absence of something he had never consciously acknowledged as present. That's how loss works when it's quiet. You don't mourn it. You're just disoriented by its absence. I watched him struggle, not dramatically but noticeably. He tried to re-establish normalcy without understanding what normal had depended on. And for the first time, I didn't intervene, not out of punishment, out of respect for my own clarity. The consequences weren't explosive, they were cumulative. Each small gap added weight. Each unanswered expectation created friction. And slowly, inevitably, the balance shifted. He didn't yet realize that what he was experiencing wasn't a phase or a mood. It was the beginning of an ending, one that had already been set in motion long before he felt it. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was no longer new to me. It had already settled, already clarified itself, already reshaped how I stood in my own life. What felt sudden to him felt long resolved to me. That difference in timing mattered more than anything else. He began asking questions, but they were the wrong ones. Are you happy? Did I do something? Why do you feel so far away lately? They weren't asked with accusation. They were asked with confusion and a growing sense of unease. He could feel the distance, but he couldn't locate its origin. And because he couldn't locate it, he assumed it could still be closed. I listened. I answered honestly, but without urgency. I told him I wasn't angry, that there wasn't one specific thing he could fix, that I hadn't been hiding anything. Each answer seemed to frustrate him more than silence ever had. He wanted a problem he could solve. What he faced instead was a conclusion. He began trying to reinsert himself emotionally, offering attention in ways that felt unfamiliar, checking in more often, making small gestures that, under different circumstances, might have meant something. But timing changes meaning. What once would have felt like effort now felt like reaction. Not insincere, just late. I could see the panic forming beneath his composure. The realization that something foundational had shifted without his participation. That the ease he had relied on was no longer available to him. He asked what I needed. I had already answered that question. For myself, there is a moment in some endings where one person is still trying to fix what the other has already finished grieving. That was where we were. He was just beginning to feel the loss. I had already processed it. I didn't feel triumphant watching him struggle. I felt calm, detached in the way you are when you've accepted something fully. There was no cruelty in my responses, just finality. He suggested counseling, adjustments, time, all reasonable suggestions, all too late. Not because change was impossible, but because I no longer wanted to negotiate for presence. I no longer wanted to rebuild a dynamic that required me to disappear in order to function. The version of me that would have tried harder was gone. That was the part he didn't understand. He thought he was speaking to the woman who had always stayed, the woman who adapted, the woman who absorbed discomfort and turned it into peace. She wasn't there anymore. I could see him trying to reach her, trying to appeal to shared history, to familiarity, to the comfort of what we had been. But history doesn't hold power when clarity replaces hope. There was no argument, no explosion, just a quiet recognition that we were no longer aligned in time or intention. He was trying to fix the past. I was standing in the present, and the present didn't include a future that required me to shrink again. That's when he understood, not fully, but enough, that something irreversible had already happened. Not when I said anything dramatic, but when he realized I wasn't trying to convince him anymore. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no rehearsed speech, no dramatic unveiling of hidden pain. It was quiet, almost restrained, as if both of us understood that anything louder would only obscure the truth. We were sitting across from each other at the table we'd shared for years. He looked tired, not just from the recent tension, but from the effort of trying to hold together something that no longer fit. I looked the same as I always had, calm, composed. That contrast unsettled him more than anger ever could have. He spoke first. I feel like I don't know where I stand anymore, he said. I nodded. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. I didn't rush to reassure him. I didn't soften the moment. I simply let it be what it was. You do know, I said gently. It's just different from what you expected. That was the first time he really looked at me. Not as a role, not as a constant, but as someone separate from his assumptions. I could see him searching for the version of me he remembered. the one who would explain, the one who would bridge the gap for him. I didn't. He asked what had changed. I told him the truth without accusation. I stopped making myself smaller to keep things comfortable, I said. Not because you asked me to, because I realized I had been doing it on my own. There was no blame in my voice, just fact. He tried to respond, to contextualize, to explain that he hadn't meant to hurt me. I believed him. Intention wasn't the issue. Impact was. I know, I said. This isn't about fault. That seemed to confuse him. People expect confrontation to come with anger. Without it, they don't know where to stand. He asked if there was anything he could do now. I paused before answering. Not for effect, but for honesty. I don't want to rebuild something that required me to disappear, I said. And I don't want to teach someone how to see me after years of being unseen. The room felt very still. There was no argument after that. Just silence. Not the old silence, the kind that absorbed tension, but a new one. Clear, undeniable. He nodded slowly, as if accepting something he couldn't change. I could see the regret forming, but it wasn't sharp. It was dull, heavy. The kind that comes when realization arrives too late to be useful. We talked logistics after that, practical things, calmly, respectfully, as two people who understood that the emotional decision had already been made. There were no promises, no dramatic goodbyes, just an understanding that this was the end of something that had quietly run its course. When the conversation ended, I didn't feel drained. I felt steady because for the first time, I hadn't abandoned myself in order to preserve peace. I'm often asked, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, how I feel now. As if there should be a single emotion that defines life after a long marriage ends. Relief, grief, freedom, loss. The truth is quieter than that. I don't feel bitter. I don't feel triumphant. I feel aligned. For the first time in a long while, my inner life and my outer life match. There is no constant translation happening, no quiet negotiation between who I am and who I'm expected to be. I wake up without bracing myself. That doesn't mean life is effortless. It means it's honest. I no longer measure my worth by how smoothly things run around me. I no longer take responsibility for other people's comfort at the expense of my own presence. I still care deeply. I still listen. But I don't disappear while doing so. I've learned that being calm doesn't require being silent. And being kind doesn't require being invisible. My identity now isn't built around endurance. It's built around discernment. I choose where my energy goes. I choose what I engage with. And most importantly, I choose when to step back. Not because I'm afraid of conflict, but because I respect my limits. There are moments of sadness. Of course there are. A shared history doesn't evaporate. It softens. It becomes something I can hold without being defined by. I don't rewrite the past as failure. I see it as a chapter where I learned the cost of not being fully present in my own life. And I don't demonize my former husband. He was living within a system that worked. For him. I was the one who outgrew it. That doesn't make either of us villains. It makes us incompatible at that point in time. What I know now is this. Clarity is quieter than resentment and far more powerful. I don't need to be seen by everyone. I just need to be seen by myself. The woman I am now doesn't wait to be noticed. She notices herself. She doesn't rush to fill silence, she listens to it. And when someone chooses to step into her life, it's not because she made it easy, it's because they chose her fully, consciously. That distinction changes everything. I am no longer the woman who holds everything together, so others don't have to feel discomfort. I am the woman who stands firmly in her own life, present, visible, and at peace with that visibility. There is a quiet lesson in this story, and it isn't about marriage ending or reconciliation failing. It's about what happens when a person slowly erases themselves in the name of harmony and what it takes to stop. For a long time, I believed that being low maintenance was a virtue, that adaptability was maturity, that if I stayed calm, understanding, and flexible, I would naturally be valued. I thought love was something you proved by making yourself easy to live with. What I learned is that love also requires presence, and presence can't exist where someone has learned to disappear. No one in my story set out to hurt me. That's important. There was no cruelty, no intentional neglect, just comfort that went unquestioned, patterns that worked until they didn't. Sometimes people don't realize what you contribute until you stop contributing it. And sometimes, by the time they notice, it's too late. Not because you're angry, but because you've already changed. Quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about self respect. It's the strength to step back without announcing it, the courage to choose alignment over familiarity, and the discipline to leave without turning your departure into a performance. I didn't leave loudly. I didn't demand understanding. I didn't seek validation. I left internally first. And once that happens, the rest is just logistics. If there's one thing I hope stays with you, it's this: silence can be a shelter or a strategy. The difference is awareness. If you've ever felt invisible in a relationship, not abused, not betrayed, just slowly overlooked, know that clarity doesn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrives with stillness. And stillness, when honored, can change the direction of your life. You don't need to punish anyone to reclaim yourself. You don't need to be loud to be firm. And you don't need permission to stop shrinking. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Now, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever realized that you were carrying more of a relationship than anyone noticed? And what happened when you finally stopped?